Greetings to all my tech heads out there in the KevTechify nation, and if you're new here, welcome. In this episode, we're going to look at network address translations, advantages and disadvantages. We'll be discussing those advantages and disadvantages of network address translation. This episode is part of my series on enterprise networking, security, and automation. I'm Kevin here at KevTechify. Let's get this adventure started. There are several advantages of NAT. One of the main advantages of NAT here is it conserves those IPv4 addresses that are so precious. There's only a limited amount of public IP addresses, and ICANN has given out all of their IP addresses for version 4. And so what we have to do is we have to figure out ways to do that, or ways to make our networks work without having public IP addresses, or limited number of public IP addresses. And that's one of the ways to do that. It allows us to run private IP addresses, the 10.0, the 172.16 addresses, and the 192.168 addresses on our internal networks. It allows us to do that. Now, it also conserves addresses through port level multiplexing. What that means is in your application, you can use multiple ports, multiple layer 4 ports. Think of the web browser. You can open up multiple tabs. You don't have to have an IP address for that. What your web browser does is randomly generates a different port number for each one. And so you use the IP address of your device, and each tab then gets its own port number to send and receive information. NAT also gives us the ability to increase our flexibility of connections to a public network. This would be upgrading or changing your internet service provider. When you change your internet service provider, you may have to change the technology. You may go from a DSL to a cable modem. You may go from a cable modem to satellite. You may go from satellite to a fiber. Whatever it is, it would allow you to change that external IP address, just like at home on your router. If you change internet service providers, though, that IP address would change, but all of your IP addressing inside of your network, that would stay the same because that's a private network. You can do what you need to in that address space. Also, it allows you to have some consistency on your internal networking addressing. What that means is we are using that private IP addresses, and you can set it up how you want, how it makes sense for your company. And then the last point here is it does provide you a level of security. It actually hides the IP address of that device on the inside of your network. If you're running a SQL database that has all your customer information, it has a private IP address on the inside of your network, but to connect to it, you have to connect to a public IP address. Your edge router does NAT and then translates it. And so it does give you a little bit of security. That way they can't directly access that. It gives a little bit of security. Not a whole lot, but it does give a little bit. There are some disadvantages. It slows down the process of forwarding packets because we have to think in process about each packet. We have to translate it, change it from one address to another address, from a public to a private or private to a public address. It will slow that down. End-to-end addressing is lost because you have private IP addressing on the end. It doesn't have that IP address that will reach its destination. Sometimes that's good, sometimes that's bad. We also lose traceability for IP version 4 from end to end. Once again, because we're doing that address translation, especially if you're doing PAT or a dynamic NAT, that could change, and you can't necessarily trace which device was at what IP address at a certain time, so you lose that traceability. We also complicate our IPsec protocols, our tunneling protocols, VPNs, because of NAT. It adds another layer of complexity. And finally, devices that need to have connection that starts from an outside device that connects to the inside of your device, adds another huge layer of complexity, because typically NAT is initiated from an inside device going outside. But if you have an outside device that needs to connect to an inside device, it's going to add that layer of complexity. It was my pleasure to provide you with this wonderful episode on network address translation, advantages and disadvantages. If you like this episode and got value out of it, and of course, depending upon what platform you're using, please click that like button, give a 5-star rating, leave a comment. This all helps me bring you more great content. Please take a minute to subscribe to my channel. All my socials and contact information are on my website, KevTechify.com, and you can get all these episodes in video and podcast form. In the upper right is my playlist for my series on enterprise networking, security, and automation. In the bottom right is one of my favorite videos that I put there just for you. Thank you so much for watching this episode of my series on enterprise networking, security, and automation. Once again, I'm Kevin. This is KevTechify. I'll see you next time for another great adventure.